we got through last time. That's Solomon's description of the build. Well, it's the writer of Kings' description of Solomon's efforts to build the temple. We spent a good bit of time on the trouble they went to keep the detail intact. That was part of the design. I think I went back and figured it out, because somebody looked at me funny when I said a lot of people wouldn't buy a house the size of the temple these days, and I think that's true. The average family is putting a bigger and bigger house on a much smaller and smaller lot, and the square footage on average has gone up, which is somewhat also why a lot of people can't afford them, because they're in the market for a house that used to be for large families, and they just have one toddler and they want 6 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms, 4,500 square feet. But the temple was, I figured, just a little over 2,700 square feet. So probably in the neighborhood being built by us, County Heights, a lot of those houses are probably in that range, the 2 stories, right? So those not super anything. So you think about that, the whole nation is operating on a brick and mortar structure, certainly a nice, well fitted, expensively fitted building, but it's only 2,700 square feet. Based on the 18-inch cubit, which we, probably was flexible, right? Even today, if you work with an old-time trim carpenter, they do not allow more than 1 tape measure on the property, because there's enough difference between tape measures and tape measure brands, even with modern techniques, that you can make your trim gappy from using. I don't know what different brands I have. I have 3 or 4 different brands. That's a big problem. Anyway, lots of trouble went into it. It was done without any kind of tools being used on the temple, but it wasn't big. And that's one thing I just want to point out when we get to here, chapter 7, is we probably ought to talk about it, right? Solomon was building his own house for 13 years. It's about how long it took me to build the last one I built. Maybe a little longer than that. And he finished all his house. He built the house of the forest of Lebanon. Okay, the cedars, right? Its length was 100 cubits, and its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits, on 4 rows of cedar pillars with cedar beams on the pillars. That comes out to being about 11,250 square feet for Solomon's house. I think they probably got it done a little quicker in some ways per square foot, because they probably allowed hammers and saws and workmen to actually do their craft in the house. But as you read that, you're like, what was Solomon doing? Why would he build only a 2,700 square foot house for the creator of the universe, and he builds an 11,250 square foot house for himself? What do you think? Okay, so it could be like the White House, right? You realize we talk about the White House as where the president lives. The president lives in the guest quarters in the White House, kind of square footage. I mean, like, it's not, there's an executive residence, and then there's this wing and that wing, and then there's all the stuff they don't let you see, right? So we'll see that Solomon builds it this way on purpose, because he does have some administration going on, and it's a household home. And is designed to keep, I think, the anointed offices distinct. There's a separation of powers involved here, I think, which is a valid principle. I mean, why would you make Yahweh's temple that size anyway, for all of the people in Israel? Remember, there's lots of people now. They filled the land, the golden age. What? I think so. I didn't compare that. We could ask that question. You all have AI assistants at your beck and call, right in your pocket, don't you? You don't even need Pastor Josh. Why do you even have that guy? Google can be your pastor, and he loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life. I'm just kidding. Google doesn't love you and does not have a wonderful plan for your life. It is what it is, right? But yeah, I think it's bigger than that, but it's not that big. I mean, so for example, right, we finished this building recently. We now have 15,000 square feet of campus space, more or less. I think that 5,000 here, 10,000 here. You can add up Solomon's palace and the square feet of the temple and have less than that for the whole country. The whole country. So why would you make the temple? Why wouldn't you think, well, maybe I ought to make it this big, that big? I ought to make it relative to my house. It ought to be at least as nice as my house. Actually, I think the temple is nicer than Solomon's house. Bigger though, right? Well, what did people do? Okay, so we have a joke on us. If you put a flat surface somewhere, it gets filled. Anybody else have that problem? If you if there's any flat surface, it gets something on it. Like I'm not talking about dirt, but just something gets stored there, put there, forgotten there, mail gets stacked there, or whatever happens. I just built a special little oak table for this 9-inch spot in between the window and the wall in our foyer. And now motorcycle helmets have been put on the base of it. That's their permanent location and all of that, right? What happens when you have a space? So when you create a useful space or a space like that, you have it's work to keep it dedicated. Does that make sense? So what happens when in Jesus's day? So compare the Temple of Solomon's day, right? And that's not the same one that Herod built, but so let's say the dimensions were the same. Okay, the foundation stones were not relaid. So those stones are the same size. And Herod the Great is famous in part because of his expansion of the temple compound. Well, what did the people do with that? Do you remember? What did Jesus have to do twice in his ministry? Yeah, drive out the money changers, get the grocery store out of the front court of the temple, quit abusing people. I mean, it wasn't even that they were doing business, it's that they were doing charlatan business. They were cheating people, stealing from them. It had people on the take, rejecting their sacrifices, so they had to buy a sacrifice there. When the people had a lot of extra space, they didn't use it well, right, when it came to the temple. And so the temple structure does not need to be huge in order to accomplish its purpose, because the priesthood was the primary feature, right? How many people go into the Holy of Holies? One. How many times a year? One. Maybe just 20 times in his life at most, So I think they kept it small to keep its purpose sanctified and keep it distinct. And it's actually, even though Solomon's house is bigger, because of all the other things, the common things, the judging of parking tickets and whatever else was going on in his house. That was bigger. Anyway, just a thought that came up to me. Why? Because 2,700 square feet doesn't sound real big, does it? You would, right? No? Is that what the Mormons built when they thought that they were building the temple? I'm not saying we need to be light. I'm just saying that it seems like they built this huge thing in the middle of Salt Lake City or whatever. It's just unusual. So as far as the significance of that, I thought we ought to talk about it a little bit. But it's 100 cubits by 50 cubits is Solomon's house. Its height is 30 cubits, quite grand dimensions. 4 rows of cedar pillars with cedar beams on the pillars. It was paneled with cedar above the side chambers, which were on the 45 pillars, 15 in each row. There were artistic window frames in 3 rows, and window was opposite window in 3 ranks. So I'm not going to draw this out for you guys, but it's another one of those construction lists, right? That he made the hall of pillars. Its length was 50 cubits and its width 30 cubits. A porch was in front of them, and pillars and a threshold in front of them. And he made the hall of the throne where he was to judge, the hall of judgment, and it was paneled with cedar from floor to floor. There's his executive room, kind of. His house where he was to live, so that's a designated space within Solomon's palace, right? The other court inward from the hall was of the same workmanship. He also made a house like this for Pharaoh's daughter, whom Solomon had married. A good way to make your otherwise a little jealous, maybe. Did anybody else get a special house made by Solomon? Or is it just Pharaoh's daughter? No? Yeah? You don't know? I think that's the only one. He's a wise man, but sometimes does things that are questionable, huh? All right. All of these were costly stones. Stone cut according to measure, sawed with saws inside and outside, even from the foundation to the coping, and so on the outside to the great court. The foundation was of costly stones, even large stones, stones of 10 cubits and stones of 8 cubits. I would take that to be not that cubit is related to cubic technically, etymologically, I don't think, but I take it to be a cubic measurement, right? So they're 10 by 10 by 10, basically, right? Big, big, big foundation stones, hard things to move. And above were costly stones, stone cut according to measure, and cedar. So the great court all around had 3 rows of cut stone and a row of cedar beams, even as the inner court of the house of Yahweh and the porch of the house. So that's his house. That's the dimensions. You can tell it's actually not as nicely finished as the temple. We okay? Is that following me along? Every once in a while, my screen's moving and the thing on the TV isn't. So King Solomon sent and brought Hiram from Tyre. Now, there's 2 Hirams from Tyre, aren't there? You remember? Hiram was the king of Tyre. That was the name of the king. This guy is other places in Chronicles, I think, is discussed the fact of his craftsmanship. He's just a different guy. I don't know if he would have been named for the king or if that was even a thing back then, but Hiram from Tyre. He's a widow's son from the tribe of Naphtali, and his father was a man of Tyre, a worker in bronze, and he was filled with wisdom and understanding and skill for doing any work in bronze. So he came to King Solomon and performed all of his work. So people look at that. It's an interesting case, right? Why did Solomon hire this guy from Tyre? It's a little bit of a hobby horse of mine right now. What? He was really, really good at what he did. Now, some of y'all are going to get this answer wrong because you're thinking in modern terms. Was this man Jewish? Was he Jewish? He would be Jewish today, wouldn't he? But was he Jewish back then? I don't think so, actually. Why not? Well, because today, who's Jewish? Anybody know how they determine the mother? If the mother is Jewish, the person is Jewish. That was a matter of coming back from the exile and the dispersion, where they had to cast the net a little bit further. So in modern days, you're a Jew physiologically, biologically, if your mother is Jewish. But that's not how it was at this time. That's not how lineage was determined at this time. So Solomon hired him because he was the best craftsman that he could get. A worker in bronze, filled with wisdom and understanding and skill for doing any work in bronze. In other words, he was a tremendous craftsman. We could read about him in other places, but we're not gonna jump over there. And so, guys, be the best at what you do to the best of your ability. Can I say that? Whether you're a believer or not, when you're working for the Lord, right? Excellence is important. So he fashioned the 2 pillars of bronze. 18 cubits was the height of one pillar. That makes sense, right? 18 cubits is how many feet? No, you didn't know Sunday school was going to be Hebrew math, did you? Huh? Yeah, roughly 27. These have capitals on top of them to make up the 30 feet. All right, so the columns are made of bronze. 12 cubits measured the circumference of both. He also made 2 capitals of molten bronze set on the tops of the pillars. The height of the one capital was 5 cubits, and the height of the other was 5 cubits. So my understanding is that they had a kind of a mortise and tenon on top. They were recessed on the top in order to hold them in place. Because you'll note that 27 feet, the ceiling height is 30 feet, right? Pillars are 27 feet, but the capitals add more than that to the height of the pillar. So I take it that they were recessed to hold the beams. Just as a side note, right? This matters, guys, it matters. Anyway, there were nets of network and twisted threads of chainwork for the capitals, which were on top of the pillars, 7 for the one capital, 7 for the other capital. So he made the pillars, 2 rows around on the one network to cover the capitals, which were on the top of the pomegranates. And so he did for the other capital. Capitals which were on the top of the pillars in the porch were lily designed 4 cubits. There were capitals on the 2 pillars, even above and close to the rounded projection, which was beside the network. And the pomegranates number 200 in rows around both capitals. It's a lot of detail here, guys. And thus he set up the pillars at the porch of the nave, and he set up the right pillar and named it Jachin, and he set up the left pillar and named it Boaz. On top of the pillars was a lily design, so the work of the pillars was finished. Just the amount, guys, of forge. What do they call it, a forge? A foundry? I think it's a foundry. Foundry, what they do. Just the amount of bronze that had to be alloyed and made was pretty impressive. They would have probably had to build a whole new furnace in order to do it, I'm sure. Work involved. Made the sea of cast metal 10 cubits from brim to brim, circular in form, and its height was 5 cubits and 30 cubits in circumference. Under its brim, gourds went around, encircling it to 10 to a cubit, completely surrounding the sea. The gourds were in 2 rows, cast with the rest. Stood on 12 oxen, 3 facing north, 3 facing west, 3 facing south, 3 facing east, and the sea was set on top of them, and all their rear parts turned inward. We're thankful for, right? You ever seen a deer mounted in full jump? Goobers that I hung out with back in the day would have both ends of that deer mounted, and they'd have the front end in the living room and the rear end in the bedroom, like parallel to each other. So it looked like it was jumping through the wall. You know, inappropriate. You always put the oxen butts backwards like this. Solomon was wise. He did that. All right. It was a handbreadth thick, and its brim was likely made like the brim of a cup as a lily blossom. It could hold 2,000 baths. Then he made the 10 stands of bronze. The length of each stand was 4 cubits, and its width 4 cubits, and its height 3 cubits. This was the design of the stands. They had borders, even borders between the frames. And on the borders which were between the frames were lions, oxen, and cherubim. And on the frames there was a pedestal above. And beneath the lions and oxen were wreaths of hanging work. So, what does that tell you about the golden era? I mean, we talked about this a little bit, about Solomon's reign. When do you stop and make this much artwork in your living room, in your house? I was making this comment as we were driving around, all the I-10 construction or whatever. And I just remember growing up in San Antonio, like all the highways, particularly the interstates. When interstates were still running on 40-year-old asphalt when I was growing up. It was a 30, 40-year-old interstate system, hadn't been in that long. And when they built it, it was just concrete, right? It looked, if you took your picture too close, it looked like the Soviet Union if you looked at the concrete, because everything's concrete, right? When we grew up, we were seeing pictures of the Soviet Union. And I just commented, I think it was Isaac was in the truck with that. I was like, it is kind of nice that they bothered to put the red color in the bricks for the retaining walls. It looks, it looks nice. But when you realize what happened, right, that the interstate system was built for national defense, not to get you where you're going quickly, right? It makes sense that they built it during the Cold War as quickly as possible with very little aesthetic consideration. There was a perceived threat at the time. It's Eisenhower's idea. Didn't he come up with that? Anybody else? No, I think it was Ike's idea. His dream child, right? But it didn't get done for a long time. Anyway, Solomon being able to stop and make his bathtub really big and really cool, right? All of this carving, all of these things that took place, took him 13 years with all of the resources that he could extract from the kingdom. Very stable for it to have 13 years where you could stop and just carve the handrails in your house. So he made the 10 stands of bronze, verse 27. The length of each stand was 4 cubits, and its width 4 cubits, and its height 3 cubits. This was the design of the stands. They had borders, even borders between the frames, and on the borders which were between the frames were lions, oxen, cherubim. On the frames there was a pedestal above, and beneath the lions and oxen were wreaths of hanging work. Now each stand had 4 bronze wheels with bronze axles, and its 4 feet had supports. Beneath the basin were cast supports with wreaths at the side. Y'all are drawing this, right? There's going to be a contest at the end. Its opening inside the crown at the top was a cubit. Its opening around like the design of a pedestal, a cubit and a half. And also on its opening there were engravings, and their borders were square, not round. Just a comment, woodworking wise, it was a lot more work to make a log square than it was to leave it round, and that's what they're talking about. Like you go, everybody know where Mesilla is. You've been to Mesilla, you walked around, ate too many chips at the restaurant, whatever you go. But it's a historic district, and you can look at the way they build adobe, right? And in some of the houses, they don't square the timbers at all that they use for the lintels on the doors. They're just logs. Some of them, they square the top and the bottom, so it'll sit on the post better. And then in some of them, they will cut the 2 ends off, the other two edges, and then you have a squared beam. So that's actually an elevation, right? It says that they were square, not round. When I'm making molding, I'm thinking it's easy. You want it round, you want it to be nice, but what they're talking about is the natural roundness of the log. Anyway, 4 wheels beneath the borders, axles of the wheels were on the stand, and the height of a wheel was a cubit and a half. The workmanship of the wheels was like the workmanship of a chariot wheel. Their axles, their rims, their spokes, and their hubs were all cast. And there were 4 supports at the 4 corners of each stand. Its supports were part of the stand itself. And on the top of the stand there was a circular form, a half a cubit high. And on top of the stand, its stays and its borders were part of it. And he engraved on the plates of its stays and on its borders cherubim, lions, and palm trees, according to this clear space on each, with wreaths all around. Made the 10 stands like this. All of them had 1 casting, 1 measure, and 1 form. So they were identical, right? Made 10 basins of bronze. 1 basin held 40 baths. Anybody with their AI assistant want to tell me how much a bath is? You can let me know. I assume it's something less than a butt load, which is actually a liquid measurement from back in the day. Y'all can check me on that. It's okay. All right. They were all identical, but they held 40 baths. Each basin was 4 cubits. On each of the 10 stands was 1 basin. And he set the stands 5 on the right side of the house and 5 on the left side of the house. And he set the sea of cast metal on the right side of the house eastward toward the south. Now Hiram made the basins and the shovels and the bowls. And so Hiram finished doing all the work which he performed for King Solomon in the house of Yahweh, the 2 pillars and the 2 bowls of the capitals, which are on top of the 2 pillars, the 2 networks to cover the 2 bowls of the capitals, which are on top of the pillars, and the 400 pomegranates for the 2 networks. I don't know why they translate that network. Anyway. NASB, don't blame me, right? 2 rows of pomegranates for each network to cover the 2 bowls of the capitals, which are on the tops of the pillars, and the 10 stands with 10 basins on the stands, and the 1 sea and the 12 oxen under the sea. The pails and the shovels and the bowls, even all these utensils which Hiram made for King Solomon in the house of Yahweh, were of polished bronze. And in the plain of Jordan the king cast them in the clay ground between Sukkot and Zarethan. So that's one of the few things they can put up with bronze casting is simply clay, right, that you dig out of the ground, and they actually are forging things. And, well, what do they call it? Not forging. Forging is the act of striking. Yeah. What is the term for that? Anybody help me out here? I have a small vocabulary. I lean on you guys. Tell me what I'm missing. All right. No? All right. Nope. Anyway, so they're having to pour these into molds, right? You hear, even today, engine blocks are usually poured into sand. Cast iron is still sand cast. At least Lodge cast iron is still sand cast. I have no idea if you can get it from China or whatever, but they're using the same sand casting system they've used their entire existence. It's one of the most durable ways of doing it and consistent ways of doing it. And so they already knew this, right? And one of the objections you end up having when people read stuff like this, they're astounded by the level of technology, actually, how much bronze they could could produce, because it messes with their timeline quite a lot. It says something unique, right, when you look at something like a young Earth creationist model, where the earliest guys might say 6,000, 6 or 7,000, up to about 10 or 12,000, I've heard, years since the Earth was created, at least was created for human habitation. There's all sorts of qualifications we could put in there. And then to see that within just really a few millennia, we have the technology to do what Solomon was not just doing, but hiring. He didn't discover it as the wisest man in the world. He just hired a guy to do it. And they argue that that's just not even possible. And then, thankfully, though, the things that they're making are found archaeologically, right? And we can actually demonstrate that it was possible. In fact, it's commonplace, just as Scripture describes it. That they were able to plate things in gold that they needed, and they were able to make these alloys of bronze and make them into very useful shapes and tools, right? And there's a lot of them. He cast them in the clay ground between Sukkot and Zarethan. Solomon left all the utensils unweighed because there were too many. The weight of the bronze could not be ascertained. And so Solomon made all the furniture which was in the house of Yahweh, the golden altar, the golden table, on which was the bread of the presence, and the lampstands, 5 on the right side, 5 on the left, in front of the inner sanctuary of pure gold, and the flowers and the lamps and the tongs of gold, and the cups and the snuffers, and the bowls and the spoons and the fire pans of pure gold, and the hinges both for the doors of the inner house, the most holy place, and for the doors of the house, that is, of the nave, of gold. Thus all the work that King Solomon performed in the house of Yahweh was finished. And Solomon brought in the things dedicated by his father David, the silver and the gold and the utensils, and he put them in the treasuries of the house of Yahweh. So he finished, right? We've talked about the value of finishing things. It's a lot easier to start things than it is to finish them. And was able to consolidate, right, the worship. Remember that we talked about this, that several weeks back, so I'll remind you, when Solomon goes and offers 1,000 sacrifices. And we talked about that it seems almost, to me anyway, that he's teetering on the edge of unacceptable syncretism, right? That he's incorporating pagan worship practices into his worship of Yahweh for political purposes or whatever. And that's the moment at which God offers him the opportunity to ask a singular wise request, and he does. And he becomes wise, and this is the wise thing to do, is to do what the Lord sets before you, to consolidate the worship, right? Because part of the problem, I think, was the separation of the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant. There wasn't the distinction, right? You needed to have, the king shouldn't have had control of the Ark of the Covenant separate from the tabernacle, which was the presence of God. All those things should not have happened. So when we read all of this detail, we read there is doctrine in that, right? It's not just a shopping list. That they're going to unify the presence of God with the worship of God, right? In Jerusalem, that's what they're going to do. And they're building it to last. It is meant to extend beyond his reign, right? We're all real happy that one administration changed to another, right? And, very pleased with the first week or whatever, fine. But how are the changes affected these days? Just executive orders, right? Good, bad, or ugly. Biden writes a bunch of executive orders. Obama did a bunch of executive orders. Trump has done it once. He's doing it again. It's always this executive order, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, right? In other words, a lot of the changes that we see, good, bad, or ugly, we look at and we go, just takes another paper to sign in a few years, and you can fix that, you can change it. In other words, the principles that our government pragmatically operates on are pretty flexible, actually, by the time we get executive orders in the mix at this quantity. That's just an illustration, right? So what is Solomon doing? Rather than saying, I hope the next king does well, and for right now, we're gonna play it safe. We're not gonna make any religious decisions for you. We don't want to assume your religion. No, he spends as much as needs to be spent and builds a temple in Jerusalem and establishes it for generations, right? He makes no bones and no apologies about making a decision about where the worship of Yahweh is going to be centered in the nation. And so there is important information there, more than just simply awe at the detail. The same thing with the consolidation of his own palace, I would say, and that is that his father may have spent a lot of his anointed life running around in the hill country. David did, right? And he's saying this is the Davidic dynasty. We're here from generation to generation. As far as I can ensure it, I'm going to do it, and we're going to build this palace. So those two offices were distinct, and yet they're acknowledging the permanence of them in the land. Any questions, comments, observations? Anybody find out how much a bath is as a volume of measure? You know anybody? How much is a bath? We don't know. Liquid. There you go. So 4 baths, a lot of gallons, man. Joe Biden wouldn't let you have that bathtub. I want you to even flush the toilet, If you eat the crickets, you flush the toilet less, and you have to take fewer showers. It's a win-win for the liberals, Anyway. Okay. Let's go on to chapter 8. I wouldn't necessarily think we were going to get through 51 verses, but it is quicker when it's a list, right? Okay, so then Solomon assembled the elders of Israel, verse 1, chapter 8, all the heads of the tribes, the leaders of the fathers' households to the sons of Israel, to King Solomon in Jerusalem, to bring up the ark of the covenant of Yahweh from the city of David, which is Zion. Right, so they're going to reunite the ark with the temple, with the Holy of Holies, and that has been the goal here, right? So all the men of Israel assembled themselves to King Solomon at the feast in the month Ethanim, which is the 7th month. When all the elders of Israel came, and the priests took up the ark, they brought up the ark of Yahweh in the tent of meeting, and all the holy utensils which were in the tent, and the priests and the Levites brought them up. And King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel who were assembled to him were with him before the ark, sacrificing so many sheep and oxen they could not be counted or numbered. There we go. Did we move? All right. Then the priest brought the ark of the covenant of Yahweh to its place in the inner sanctuary of the house, to the most holy place under the wings of the cherubim. For the cherubim spread their wings over the place of the ark, and the cherubim made a covering over the ark and its poles from above. But the poles were so long that the ends of the poles could be seen from the holy place before the inner sanctuary, but they could not be seen outside, and they are there to this day. It's an interesting factoid, right? Whatever day it is that they're looking back from. And they're saying if you could go in the Holy of Holies, you could see the original poles there, There's nothing in the ark except the 2 tablets of stone which Moses put there at Horeb, where Yahweh made a covenant with the sons of Israel when they came out of the land of Egypt. And it happened that when the priest came from the holy place, the cloud filled the house of Yahweh. So the priest could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of Yahweh filled the house of Yahweh. Now, I imagine, frankly, that's probably a statement of actually almost terror. The priest could not stand to minister because of the cloud. We talked about that, right? The high priest could enter the sanctuary once a year on the Day of Atonement. That was his job. You imagine that you're standing in this place and all you're doing is moving stuff. That's what they're doing. They have to have sanctified movers to move these items. They come into the holy place, and all of a sudden God's presence is with them. That could be fearful, right? That's the kind of thing. We're not sure if it's just anecdotal, but when I was a kid, I was told that somebody thought that they actually eventually started tying a rope around the high priest's waist in case he approached God's presence in an unworthy manner, and all of a sudden they had a corpse stuck. And their solution was not to make sure the high priest was worthy or ask him any questions or whatever. The solution was tie a rope around his waist and drag his corpse out. Now, again, I'm not sure that was accurate, but that's what was said, right? So coming before the presence of Yahweh in a new place, right? Did we get all the trim done? Did we get every detail done? Is it worthy? Is it appropriate? It had to have been scary, I think. So Solomon said, Yahweh has said that he would dwell in the thick cloud. I have surely built you a lofty house, a place for your dwelling forever. So that was his intent. I think we talked about that a little bit, was that this house would be a permanent place. And that comes up today, right? Is everybody still honoring the ceasefire? What was that, a 60-day or 90-day ceasefire? I haven't. Huh? The ceasefire is over today. I thought it was longer than that. Anyway, so what's the argument, right? The argument, you'll hear a lot of actually pretty anti-Semitic arguments. So if you hear somebody say, this is coming up a lot, that the people in the nation of Israel right now aren't even Jews, they will try to say that they're just Semitic people. They're not distinct from the people around them. They're not nationally or biologically really distinct from the peoples around them, and they're just being kind of violent stinkers trying to hold on to this land and claim Jewishness. And if you hear somebody say that, just understand that's pragmatically, that's nonsensical, because other nations know exactly who they are, right? The Muslims know exactly who the Jews are. They're not fighting them because they're basically just Muslims, right? The Third Reich knew exactly who the Jews were. And so acting like we now all of a sudden don't know who the Jews are is stupid. But part of the argument, right, is over who owns the Temple Mount, who has a right to have their center of worship there. And we, again, you'll also hear somebody say, well, we're not even sure that's where the temple goes. I don't think that that's a problem. I think that is where the temple goes. It was intended to be a permanent dwelling place, and it was erected at this time, and has, was created for that purpose in a sanctified spot, right? We know where it is. We don't have to argue and fuss and just agree to move it somewhere else, which has been proposed to us. But that's what Solomon built, right? Solomon built something that would be a dwelling place forever. It would be forever recognized. Even at the time of the writing of Kings, they were to look back and go, this is a historical fact. It actually happened, and it was there. Even though right now, I think if they decided it was a retaining wall or a warehouse wall in a temple compound, like the Wailing Wall, that's what we called it. We're not sure what part of the temple that even is. That's the closest they get. It's supposed to be their dwelling place forever. Right. So the king faced about and blessed all the assembly of Israel, while all the assembly of Israel was standing. And he said, Blessed be Yahweh, the God of Israel, who spoke with his mouth to my father David, and has fulfilled it with his hand, saying, Since the day I brought my people Israel from Egypt, I did not choose a city out of all the tribes of Israel in which to build a house, that my name might be there. But I chose David to be over my people Israel. Now it was in the heart of my father David to build a house for the name of Yahweh, the God of Israel. But Yahweh said to my father David, Because it was in your heart to build a house for my name, you did well that it was in your heart. Nevertheless, you shall not build the house, but your son who will be born to you, he will build the house for my name. Now Yahweh has fulfilled his word which he spoke, for I have risen in the place of my father David and sit on the throne of Israel as Yahweh promised, and have built the house for the name of Yahweh, the God of Israel. There I have set a place for the ark, in which is the covenant of Yahweh, which he made with our fathers when he brought them from the land of Egypt. So he's consecrating it, declaring what its purpose is to the people, right? That's a historical record, a historical fact. Historical people, I'm not sure what is out there in the Bible that you won't find somebody to object to, but often you hear that. You'll hear objection about the historicity of the Exodus. You'll hear, as much as you hear people arguing over, creationism. You hear them arguing over the Exodus. You hear them arguing over the Davidic era. Was there even such a thing as a golden era? And you're just wondering if somebody who argues whether David and Solomon ever existed has ever actually been to Israel. Like, I have not personally been to Israel, but I never met somebody who went to Israel to look at evidence of the Davidic monarchy and didn't find it. Right? It's there. And it is evidence. It's evidence of the historicity of the people and the historicity of the record, the reliability of it. So, it was intended to be permanent, had the capacity to be permanent, but the people unfortunately failed to preserve that. So Solomon stood before the altar of Yahweh, verse 22, in the presence of all the assembly of Israel, and spread out his hands toward heaven. He said, O Yahweh, the God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven, above or on earth beneath, keeping covenant and showing loving kindness to your servants who walk before you with all their heart, who have kept with your servant, my father David, that which you have promised him. Indeed, you have spoken with your mouth and have fulfilled it with your hand, as it is this day. Now, therefore, O Yahweh, the God of Israel, keep with your servant David, my father, that which you have promised him, saying, you shall not lack a man to sit on the throne of Israel, if only your sons take heed to their way to walk before me as you have walked. Now, therefore, O God of Israel, let your word, I pray, be confirmed, which you have spoken to your servant, my father David. But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house which I have built? Yet have regard to the prayer of your servant and to his supplication, O Yahweh my God, to listen to the cry and to the prayer which your servant prays before you today. That your eyes may be open toward this house night and day, toward the place at which you have said, my name shall be there, to listen to the prayer which your servant shall pray toward this place. Listen to the supplication of your servant and of your people Israel when they pray toward this place. Here in heaven, your dwelling place. Hear and forgive. If a man sins against his neighbor and is made to take an oath, and he comes and takes an oath before your altar in this house, then hear in heaven and act and judge your servants, condemning the wicked by bringing his way on his own head, justifying the righteous by giving him according to his righteousness. When your people Israel are defeated before an enemy, because they have sinned against you, if they turn to you again and confess your name and pray and make supplication to you in this house, then hear in heaven and forgive the sin of your people Israel and bring them back to the land which you gave to their fathers. We'll carry on here in a minute, but I do want you to note that the only alternative that Solomon sees here at all, in fact, if the people are defeated by their enemy, there's only one situation that causes that, right? That they have sinned against God. We made that point over and over, in the entrance generation. We were going through Joshua. We made that point going through Judges, that there's only really one thing that causes Israel to be defeated before their enemy or to be ejected from their land. And it has really nothing to do with how many Jews are living in the land, how good their equipment is, how good their strategy is. I think they recently had a massive retirement party in the IDF, didn't they? Lost a lot of people that were in trouble, or that were in charge on October 7th last year, or year 4 now. There's only one situation, that is really having a king that is faithful. Actually, if we're to condense it down to the absolute bare minimum, it gets down to that. So we'll pick up at verse 35 next week. I think we're out of minutes. Do we have any questions or comments about what Solomon is doing here in that last section?
I'm curious about verse 9. It said there was nothing in the ark except the 2 tablets of stone that Moses put.
Yeah.
Wasn't the rod of Aaron supposed to be in there?
It may have been supposed to be in there. I think what they're pointing out is that it wasn't. Now, in other words, I'm not sure what the significance of that is, but it's what it says. Nothing put in there. They didn't add anything. It wasn't a time capsule. Yeah. Now, I'm not sure that it didn't exist or where it was, and I'm not aware of any cross-reference. In fact, yeah. Yep. At one time, it's in there, and a lot of imagination has been extended as to whether the Ark of the Covenant is still in existence, physically anymore. Of course, but yeah, I would just take that at face value. But there's no information as to why or what happened. We can go ahead and turn that off, Dan. All right, let's pray, and then we'll be dismissed.